Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. This is the Harry Bridges School of Labor and the class on external organizing.
So this class is extremely important because we all have different paths on how we arrive at our class consciousness. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to involve any type of interaction with unions, even though those can represent the highest form of class consciousness absent of theory. So for those sections that aren't familiar with it, this is an extremely important class to help educate on that aspect. And there is a article that was written by Foster called "The Question of the Unorganized." And it's the unorganized workers, which a lot of the labor movement, especially those sections of the labor movement that are in comfortable positions, tend to not try to even deal with. And he says in the article that the present period presents an exceptionally favorable time to bring the unorganized masses into the unions. Industry is going ahead at a relatively high rate. The workers are bitterly exploited. Their standards of living are not advancing. In fact, in many industries, in spite of the prosperity of the employers, the workers are facing wage cuts. There is much discontent in their ranks. The situation is ripe for a great drive for organization. The present period of, quote, prosperity cannot last indefinitely. Already there are signs of its weakening. We must take to the fullest advantage the situation now. The workers are in a mood to organize. We must take the lead and show them how. The failure of the unions to strengthen their ranks, now by the inclusion of the vast masses of the unorganized, will expose them to the most deadly dangers in the slack industrial period that is not far ahead, when the employers will renew their, quote, open shop campaign of destruction against the unions with redoubled vigor. The Trade Union Educational League is fundamentally correct when it places as point one in its program of action the initiation of a general campaign to organize the millions of unorganized workers. And so that's why today we're having this class, and why we place such an importance on the involvement in the furtherance of organizing education.
Okay. So first, just a basic interview of unionism as a concept. Unions are workers coming together to promote their common interests, based solely on that interest that workers have in common. Unions mean democracy at work where there was none before. And the way that I frame this when I'm explaining it in the most rudimentary way that I can, if you go to your boss with any sort of issue, whether it's like harassment from customers or a leaky ceiling or just a pay raise or something, if you do it by yourself, you're going to get kicked down the road, or you're going to get a bunch of excuses, or you name it. But if you start to talk to your coworkers about the issue and find out, how common the issue is, or how everybody feels about it, and then you start to come together, then a boss can't just kick it down the road anymore. Because if the entire store is upset about something and they're willing to stop production in order to make sure that something's done about it, then the boss has something that they can't ignore anymore. And unions have been around as long as there have been workers and bosses ruling over them. So there's a lot of rich history that is worthy of its own class. But right now, we're just talking about basically an organizing 101 sort of training. And then, final point is um, there's a difference between industrial or craft unionism that should be understood, where craft unionism is on a trade to trade basis. But industrial unionism realizes that not only are workers stronger together within a single shop or within a single craft, but workers across an entire industry are more powerful. Um, so you could even refer to a union like the United Steelworkers, which deals with steel as a craft, but the United Steelworkers has unionized a couple of Starbuckses. So I guess just because they're a very class conscious union, at least enough to be willing to organize outside of their own um, craft, as it were. Um, but yeah, so that's all I'll say on that point. So if you're really starting from scratch, you need to know which union you want to go with to, or how you even want to get started with what sort of style of organizing you're going to go with. And on one end of the spectrum, you can just start your own union. You can self-organize and start an independent union and try to go that route. The advantages to this is you it's going it's about as grassroots as it gets, and you're not going to the bosses are going to have a really hard time using a lot of the third party narrative or the narrative that big labor is coming in here and trying to disrupt things in our workplace. Because if you're starting a union, it's really not a very good narrative for them to use, because they're like, no, this is actually a new union. Um, at least that's the path that the ALU took in with Amazon. And I don't know enough details about how that's done to explain the nuts and bolts of the process, but that's certainly a path to take. On the other end of the spectrum, you can go straight to um, a well-funded, well-staffed, maybe even AFL-CIO affiliated union, and you're likely to receive a lot of input, a lot of help, plenty of people who are wanting to assist you, and they can take care of paperwork, legal proceedings, organizing rallies, and whatnot. If you're lucky. The thing is a lot of mainstream unions, they're not very good at grassroots organizing, basically because they collaborate with the bosses so much that they don't even see the reason why they want to organize. And B, if they are interested in organizing, they might not be very good at it, at least on a grassroots level. So those are kind of the two extremes. Um, what you can do is go with, maybe you can find a union that's kind of in the middle of the road. And in my opinion, Workers United is, that's part of the reason for their success, is they are affiliated with the SEIU and they receive funding from the SEIU, which is it's not an AFL-CIO union, the SEIU, but it is a bigger, well-funded service employees union. Um, so Workers United is affiliated with them, um, and they have staff, like a couple dozen for the whole country, but they are very small. They are very feisty, and they are very good at grassroots organizing. Um, and you almost like, and I have my criticisms of them as well. I think they could use more staff, just to help out with everything. I think they're a little too small. Um, but that's my assessment of the situation, is do your research and stay in touch with your friends at Luell while you're at it.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. This is never the way we did it in the past. Never. I understand what you're saying, and it has interesting connotations. It comes straight from American individualism, right from the start. The collective is looked at weird. The collective is far away. It's not part of us. This kind of mentality, which is so prevalent in this country. So I could see how that would be successful on a certain level. On the other hand, we have to be pushing the idea that in unity there's strength. And the more of us that join together, the stronger we'll be. Not that if we do things small on our own, separately, we're gonna be strong. I don't. It's a way of looking at things, I guess. That's all. Thank you.
I can definitely see where the individualism could come in about wanting to start their own union. The other aspect to it that Foster talks about is it comes from a frustration with the older unions and their refusal to organize. And so if workers go to the unions and the unions tell them that they're not going to organize them or help them, then they're kind of left with the situation where they have to form their own union. Or if they know that the bigger union is incapable of doing it, even if they want to put resources towards it, the workers will tend to go towards forming their own union because the older unions don't know how to do it, and they're will only accept a campaign if it's on a silver platter. That's the way that Foster said it.
I gotta just interject this one thing. Look at the history of workers' movements in general that are on the left. They leave a national formation. Instead of joining another group that's national, they go on their own. This idea that if we control our own thing, it'll be better. So we have one little puddle, and we think if we control the three frogs in that one little puddle, that's going to be good. I don't see it, but I noticed that that's what has happened with the left, the workers' movement. I call it the workers' movement.
I'm sorry. So my brain is a little fuzzy. I just got done working out. So is there a reason why like United Steelworkers would also organize with like Starbucks workers? To me, it would make sense like if craft unions within the same supply chain or industry like organized together. But like there are frequently like unions that have nothing to do with each other. Is there a reason for that, or is it just because like they need the manpower, they need the representation and stuff like that?
I can't say exactly, but my guess is just that um, union victories anywhere is good for organized labor. And if people are willing to stick their neck outs in a Starbucks or any other industry to try and unionize their workplace, then a union like the United Steelworkers is willing to help out. Um, there's like the one that I'm referring to is one that's in Canada that unionized around 2020. And I don't know the full story of who reached out to who or whatnot, but that's the one that I'm referring to.
Through my experience, the teachers union in New York, they decided to go out and have a separate division and organize nurses. We already have unions that organize nurses. One of them is the New York, I think it's Nurses Association. And another one was a local 1199, if you ever hear of that group. They also had a division doing nurses. We used to call that a form of rating, unions rating jurisdictions of other unions. I don't see it as a positive thing. I see it as counterproductive. We have good, unions organizing in all these areas. Why are we as teachers, for example, going into a totally different area, as Remy said? It's because we want the money, I'll be honest, from those members that join us. And I think that has a lot to do with it as far as the teachers union is concerned. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it has more to do with the workers that want to organize the workplaces for the most part. I mean, there's exceptions to everything. They go to whatever union will say yes to them. And the unions that'll say yes to them, usually because of the money. The United Steelworkers also tried to organize minor league baseball players until the Major League Baseball Players Union claimed jurisdiction on them a couple years ago. So the workers will go whoever will say yes, and it's a matter of the unions that are already in those fields to claim jurisdiction.
All right. So let's get back into the slides. So this is how to organize on a shop to shop basis, like a Starbucks, but it could be a retail center, it could be a Home Depot, anything that has four walls and a roof. The first thing that you need to do is you need to do your homework and collect information and do your research. So basic info like names, contact info, what time people work and when they work their shifts. This is the process. This is the beginning process of workplace mapping, which is not only collecting people's basic info, but also who has social connections, who is well liked, who is related, is anybody rooming together, is anybody in a relationship together. Things like these is how you start to draw the connections between your coworkers, and whoever ends up having the most connections is basically the people who have the most influence and social pull within your workplace. You also can draw a physical map of your workplace as well and analyze it from that angle. Most of the time, whoever's in charge has some sort of easy view of the shop floor or everybody who is working there or is in some sort of position of power. But this can also help you figure out good places to have conversations where the bosses won't be able to see or hear you. It's not easy, but this is a good way to look at things. Also, you can analyze who works in what parts of the shop and who is more likely to, who's in each department, who's going to be able to have social connections with who by where they physically work in the shop. This is another way to analyze people's connections to each other. And then once you begin to draw the dots or connect the dots, these people are your natural leaders and eventually people who you would ideally want on your organizing committee. We'll get to that in a little bit, though. This is one part of analyzing your workplace. Then you start to take guesses just from conversations that you've already had, or just how people act or their general worldview on who you think might be pro you. Break them down into these 5 categories. Ones and twos are people who are pro union. Ones are people who are pro union and also accomplish tasks. If it's something as simple as answering a phone call or helping you with your spreadsheets or talking to another coworker and helping you find out if they're pro union or not, or meeting your union organizer or your staff member who you're in contact with. Any sort of task and whether they complete it is what differentiates ones from twos. Twos are good. You want everybody to be a two, and you don't want or need everybody to be a one. You're not trying to turn your shop into one big organizing committee. You're just trying to figure out who is organizing committee capable. Then you get down to the threes, which are people who are neutral, either because they don't know anything about unions, they're trying to hear out both sides and they're indecisive, or they're just trying to avoid any sort of confrontation or any sort of reason to displease anybody. And they think that being neutral is going to be the best way to do that. But ultimately, when it comes down to an election, they're going to vote no because they are going to go with what they're most familiar with. When they are given the chance, if they're not very comfortable with the idea of unionizing, they're probably going to go with what they're most familiar with, which is not having a union in the first place. So that's why being able to identify threes is very important. Then you move down to fours and fives, which are basically the same thing on the other end, which means that they're anti-union. And if they're a 5, that means that they're taking actions to undermine the union itself, whether it's spreading misinformation or talking to people about why they should vote no for the union or completing any sort of tasks for the bosses as far as undermining the union is concerned. So those are the 2 ways that you build a workplace spreadsheet, is workplace mapping and assessing union support. Okay. The best way to assess union support or ask people to join your organizing committee is by talking with them directly. When you're doing this, you should know ahead of time when you're going to do this. So ideally, you have your schedule and other people's schedule down, and you know exactly what time of day you're going to have this conversation. It just helps with the anxiety or, not knowing if you're going to say your words. The more you plan it out, the better it's going to be. And the first thing you should do is know how you're going to start the conversation. You don't want to jump right into the conversation right away. And you especially don't want to use the word union right off the bat, especially if you've never talked to anybody about unionizing in your entire workplace thus far. So an icebreaker can just be, how you doing? Did you watch the game last night? Usual stuff, just to get the conversation started. But what you want to do pretty quickly is shift the conversation to workplace issues and do a little bit of agitation, which also isn't that different from a normal conversation. It's just griping about, um, customers, um, your crazy schedule. Everybody gripes about work. That's not anything out of the ordinary. But what you do is you start to ask the question, what would happen if we went to the manager about this? And you start to frame it in the way that, like I mentioned earlier, if anyone goes to the manager as an individual, it's not going to get anything done because that's how the manager likes it. That's what their open door policy is please walk through that open door one at a time so that we can tell everybody no once and then send them right back out the door. Then you start to frame it like, well, also, I might add, is actually ask them that. What would happen if you go to the manager and let them answer? They might surprise you. They might, but don't just tell people these sort of things. Ask these questions and then give them time to process and give you an answer. And then once they do, you can ask them, frame it where you start to say, what if, how many people in this workplace have the same issue? What if we all went to the manager and started to tell them how many of us actually are concerned about this issue? Then you start to frame, then you start to build the concepts of a union in the people's head without having to talk about unions explicitly. And this helps people understand what unions are without having to deal with what people think unions are and all of the jargon and all of the ways that we're all programmed to think about unions. You start to give people the most fundamental idea of what a union is. Then, once you start to get this idea in their head, you can start to talk about unions explicitly and say, we should form one. We should form a union. We should get in contact with this union that I've been interested in, and we should get representation in this place so we don't have to put up with all this crap all the time. And then you really call the question and you say, can I count on you so we can defend ourselves? And you give them time to answer. If and when they say no, hopefully they say yes, of course, and then you can move on from there. But if and when they say no, you reply with the question, what is holding you back? And like always, you give them time to think through their answer and give it to you, and then you listen intently to what they say. Then you want them to eventually say yes, but it's your job to explain how, whatever reason, whatever the reservations are, a union can help. So what you utilize is what we call AAR, affirm, answer, and redirect to the issues. Whatever their answer is why they don't want to unionize, you, like, they don't have enough time, or they don't make enough money or something like that. Of course, people don't have enough time because everybody has to work so much just to pay bills that they can't even think straight. If people had a union, then they would be able to have more money and more regular schedules so that they wouldn't be so overwhelmed with work. And then they might actually be able to think straight. So, but the most important thing is affirm whatever their issues are of why they don't want to get involved, and then answer their issue with how a union would help that issue, and then redirect back to their issue, back to the original issues that you were talking about, and then call the question again, can I count on you? And then they might say no again. but you can continue through many cycles of AAR before you actually hear a yes. Once they do say yes, you say, great, don't let the boss find out about this. Retaliation is one reason, but don't scare them off that way either. Just let them understand that bosses don't want unions because they don't want to lose power. And most people understand it pretty good. And then make sure you set a time and a date to be able to go over things later. And you have to say something on the shop floor to get things started, but ideally have these conversations when you're not at the workplace. Try and go get coffee or something like that. Questions really quick, because I'm going to start racing through these slides.
This sounds like, so it's all going on in one conversation. It's not like you're planting a seed, letting them incubate a little bit and then coming back to them. Is this, there's no time between. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm having a hard time.
You can.
Phrasing.
You can, but that's not going to get that's not a bad tactic, but ultimately you do have to get to this sort of style of conversation where you ask a hard answer and then get them to show up to a meeting or meet your organizer or something like that. So that's not a bad way to do it, but ultimately you do have to get into a more difficult conversation like this.
So I guess I'm asking because it's supposed to catch them out off guard, and before they can really, think about it too in depth, they're already committed.
I guess the risk is, if people say, I guess the risk is, you have to feel these conversations out on a case by case basis. If you get ideas that someone might even be anti-union right off the bat, then you should probably back off and not ask the question or tell them about the union, as an example, because then they might go rat you out to your manager, just as an example. So each conversation can be different. But if you have somebody who you think is pro-union, it's best to get the ball rolling, because the longer the process takes, in a lot of ways, you're putting yourself more at risk that word is going to get slipped and you're going to be retaliated against.
Yeah, on the first slide of this section with the ones through fives, I just want to say the way it's worded on the slide, I think it's a little misleading. Threes, especially at the beginning process, those are the people you need to target. You shouldn't be writing them off as they're going to ultimately vote no. Sure, when you get to the end and you're at the election, you can't determinatively say yes, they will be voting for you. But those are the people at the beginning you need to win over. Because the fours and fives are the people that want nothing to do with it. The threes are the ones you're going to win. Because if you don't win over the threes, you're just preaching to the choir and you're going to end up losing. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Back at it. Okay. So an organizing committee itself is 10%, give or take, of a workplace, tasked with building the union and gaining support. They do the tasks and they make things happen, whether it's getting cards signed, having conversations, forming meetings, or staying in touch with the union itself. It should be representative of the workplace and ideally consisted of the natural leaders of your workplace. The people who are the natural leaders in your workplace might not be pro-union right off the bat, but that's the importance of analyzing your workplace and making sure that those are the people that you talk to early on before the bosses do, to be able to bring them to your side and ideally get them on your committee. Also, if you're in a majority Black or people of color workplace, or if you're in a majority female workplace, you have to make sure that your organizing committee is representative of those people. If you don't, then the bosses are going to squash your committee like a bug, because they're going to be able to say that your committee doesn't represent the workplace, and they will be right. Workers who complete tasks obviously are the ones. Oh, also, if someone is pro-union, that doesn't necessarily, and even if they complete tasks, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a good committee member, because if they are maybe annoying, or if nobody in the shop likes them, you should not put them on your organizing committee, because as soon as other people find out, they're going to be like, so and so's on the organizing committee. Okay, well, I don't think we need a union because people will feel like they'll just be turned off by the whole idea. But last point on this is also your organizing committee isn't going to stay the way it is the whole time. People are going to go back to school. People are going to have a kid, or they're going to have to take care of a sick relative. So always be analyzing who is going to be next on your organizing committee. Next slide. Once you're ready, you need to sign authorization cards to get the election started in the first place. Any workplace needs a minimum of 30% to have it, but you want to get to like 75 or 80%, because those numbers are going to drop as you get closer to your union election. And ideally, you're no lower than 55% of the workplace is still ready to vote yes. They can be digital, they can be physical. I prefer the physical, obviously. And yeah, it's not, also, you can tell people like, hey, this is not going to be like, it's confidential information. Signing a union card can be a little intimidating for some people, but make sure to tell them that it's just you, and the union is going to be the only people who ever see that. In Canada, and if we pass certain pieces of legislation in this country, signing cards can be the sole means of unionizing. That Starbucks that I mentioned that was unionized through the United Commercial Workers, they got like 80-90% cards signed. And in Canada, if you get that high percentage signed in a workplace, you don't even need an election. They immediately became union. Next slide. Okay. After you get cards signed, you go public, which means you file the paperwork to have your election with the NLRB, and then your bosses know about it. So that means they're going to be on your case. And you're going to have, well, and this is Starbucks, so it's going to be it can be very different from any other industry, but stores at the beginning of the campaign, like mine, I had to wait 4 months before my election happened from when we went public. So that gives the bosses all the time in the world to squash the campaign. But now we're at about 6 weeks, because the bosses can't just fudge everything in the hearings and drag out more time anymore, because we've put enough through the process that they just can't do that anymore. Have a press release beforehand, and a way to get the word out about the campaign as it's happening. Contact media, contact local unions and organizers. And then throughout this process, the bosses are going to be talking to everybody in the workplace, and you need to keep the inoculation up. Make sure you're responding to what the bosses are saying and how, and anything that they're doing, and make sure to counter their narrative. However, do not oversaturate your coworkers with union, because that's also going to turn people off from voting yes as well. If people get so oversaturated with union jargon and union talk, they're going to be like, oh crap, this this is not what I want. I want to have a normal life and come to work and go home just like anybody else. And now everything's changed and my whole life revolves around the union. A lot of people don't want that. So you need to be able to be a normal human being and have normal conversations with people still, and then talk about union issues sparingly and when you have to. Also, retaliation is still possible, but once you go public, it's less likely because they're not going to reach. It's easier to prove that you were trying to organize your workplace once you go public. And doing interviews, showing up to public events, making friends with local politicians, that also helps you not be retaliated against as well. Next slide. Once you get closer to your election, you need to solidify your yes votes. Focusing on threes and neutrals is the most important thing that you need to do. It's usually most people in your workforce. And they are the deciding factor in the election, and they're also definitely the people that your boss is targeting as well. Normalize the union ideas of the union. Make sure that it's not this weird foreign concept to them as best as you can, and make sure you share with them the issues that started this union campaign in the first place. Be like, so and so is upset they haven't had a raise in 5 years. Make sure to let them know a lot of things that people kind of keep secret for a long time because they're afraid to talk about. And then, of course, remember AAR. Also, do not talk to fours and fives. It will always backfire on you. You're not only are you not going to convince them, but it's just going to be a waste of your energy. People, when they're anti-union, they're pretty decided against it. You just show up to work and be a normal human being and just do what you do and then go home at the end of the day. Also, if and when they take actions to squash your union, do not have a conniption. Do not take it personally. Stay cool as a cucumber. Eat no matter how bad it hurts, because you're putting your neck out and you're putting a lot of time and effort into this union campaign. And now somebody who you've worked with for X number of time is trying to throw it all out the window. It's easy to react very negatively to these things, but you need to try to not to, because it's just going to feed into their strategy. Other things that you can do to solidify the yes vote is marches on the boss to take care of workplace hazards, or if organizers are being targeted by management. Also make a list of people who you are confirmed for yes votes as it leads up to it, and then expect management to pull some sort of stunt, especially right before the election. They're going to do something. They're not going to take it sitting down. Next slide. After the election, when you win, you need to establish a bargaining committee whose job is drafting the contract and negotiating with management. The contract needs to be reflective of the issues that people helped, why people started the union in the first place. And everybody needs to have a say in it if it's going to be something worth fighting for. Management's going to dig in their heels and not negotiate with you at every turn. If it means not showing up to the bargaining table, throwing every legal hoop that you have to jump through as possible. The best way to get them to actually bargain with you is tangible strike power. And if they're violating labor law, and if they're not coming to the bargaining table, then you can strike over it just to try and because you've filed so many unfair labor practices. And last quick point, if you lose the election, you can stick it out for a year before you can file again if you think that's a tangible strategy. talk it out with your coworkers and talk it out with your union representative, if that's something you want to do. If not, if you just went through a union election, you are a skilled organizer and you are a hot commodity, and plenty of unions would happy to hire you as an organizer because you have more experience than a lot of people do working in unions today. So you can do that. But whatever you do, don't let your experiences go to waste. Get in contact with other shops like yours and help them through the process to the best of your ability.
All right, with that, we'll break for our last round of questions and comments.
Yeah, just wanted to mention also, if you can talk about the game at work, or if you can talk about anything that's not work related, legally you can talk about a union as well. That's basically how the law works. If your work restricts what you can talk about to only work related things, then that's a little bit more difficult. Don't get caught. Know who you're talking to, or just play it safe and only talk on break and outside of work. And then a lot of unions have resources like they have pamphlets that tell you some of the most common laws that are violated by employers during a campaign. And it can help you to know exactly what to expect. And that actually was pretty helpful for me in my campaign, because I pretty much had most of them happen. And being able to know what law was being broken was helped improve my ability to relay that to the organizers, and then for it to be translated into a ULP. And something that a lot of organizers probably don't want to do, but it is possible. And I'm not saying this is applicable in every single situation, but if you're at a shop where you basically get everyone to sign the card, and you feel relatively confident in the ability of the shop to stick together, you could legally go on strike to force recognition of the union so that you could bypass the election. Organizers don't recommend that because there is the risk that comes along with a strike, and that would be the first time y'all go on strike. But there have been instances even recently where that's happened and it did work. So that's my 2 cents on that section.
All right, thank you. I couldn't help but when looking at the two union cards, some differences between the two. Specifically with the UFCW card, it asks for the department you're in. And this is a key difference between the RWDSU organizing campaign, which is RWDSU is a subsidiary union of the UFCW, and the Amazon Labor Union campaign. RWDSU was obviously the ones involved with Bessemer, Alabama, where Alia was here in Staten Island. But and this goes to the mistakes made by the RWDSU and why that campaign ultimately failed, was when they did not try to organize the entire building. They were only trying to organize certain departments. And this is a tactic employers will use if you're not trying to organize the whole building. They can go to the NLRB and make the bargaining unit larger and encompass the whole building or whatever parts of the building they want. And technically, that's legal and that'll get accommodated. When you're organizing a workplace, you need to make sure you're organizing the entire workplace. Do not just go departmentally. That could work in some cases, don't get me wrong. That's not smart. That opens it up to craft unionism where the workplace is divided in different unions, like many UFCW workplaces are. You want one workplace for the entire, one union for the entire workplace. And if you don't organize from the beginning and file for the entire workplace, the employer will try to expand the bargaining unit, which will lower your, which could ultimately throw out your petition, because it could make you fall under the amount of signatures you need as well. That's one thing to keep an eye out on when you try to organize.
Yep. Real quick, even in Starbucks cases, they would originally trying to make the argument that entire cities had to have elections at once. And that was the landmark decision that a judge made up in Buffalo, is that no, it can happen shop by shop and not on like a citywide basis. So that's a classic tactic that they always use, is they try and dilute the power. That's all I got.
All right, with that, we'll close out with a great song that's relevant to the class. Union Made.